I have been involved with the Way of the Cross Walk for Justice for many years. Back in 1983, a group of folks were meeting at the National Assembly for the Pax Christi meeting at Mount St. Joseph. And out of that came the idea for presenting the Stations of the Cross in a way that would raise people's awareness of the injustices in our current systems. Sister Alice Gerdeman was part of that group, and several of them worked on it for about a year and a half. And then in 1985, had their first presentation in downtown Cincinnati. It started off very slowly, but gradually gained a lot of input and energy as people became aware of the event. In the late 80s, they attracted almost 2,000 people at the event. It took place in downtown Cincinnati. They initially started with 14 stations, but pared those down to 9 eventually. The way it presented itself as different groups from the Archdiocese, particularly, would present various stations. We have used several things that help people focus on the stations and the presentations. One of which is a beautiful old cross that really is life-size, that is carried by various participants during the presentations. And then there's always been a procession, a walk involved, similar to what Jesus did when he walked his way from one episode to another on his way to Calvary. I started attending in the early 90s, and for me, it was an amazing awakening of the injustices in our city and beyond. Most people at that time, I don't think I was unique, were becoming aware of the Catholic social teachings and what it was calling us to as lay people to respond to. And the Walk of Justice tapped into that need, I think. Each station walked around downtown Cincinnati. We would stop at a bank and we would hear the story of the 30 pieces of silver where Judas took money to betray Jesus. And we'd hear about the inequities in the banking system. And then we'd move on to the Justice Center where we would stand and hear about Jesus going before the judges and the inequities in our criminal justice system. It was a visceral event. It just got you in your gut as you applied the suffering and passion of Jesus to those who were suffering in our own neighborhoods. As I mentioned, Sister Alice Gerdeman was one of the original founders of the Way of the Cross. And when she became the coordinator for IJPC, the event became organized by IJPC at that point. She led that group from 1988 to 2006. I became an avid event goer. And in the early 2000s, I ended up on the board of IJPC, which was a wonderful privilege, and got to actually work on the planning for the Way of Justice at that time. After the riots in 2001, the event became much smaller for lots of reasons. People were hesitant to go downtown. We became increasingly difficult to get the necessary permits for us to process. And our supporters were not quite as adamant as they had been originally. So we had to rethink how we wanted to do it. And in the early 2000s, we ended up cutting it down to just 5 stations, 4 of which we presented at Fountain Square and then processed to the Freedom Center. In 2013, for the first time since 1983, it was put on a hiatus. I was not involved at that particular time, but we all mourned the end of the event. We really missed it. And so in 2017, several of the folks who had been involved earlier approached the new coordinator, Allison, and asked if we could do it again.
I remember when we first started talking about doing the Way of the Cross again. And since I had become the director at IJPC, I had heard a lot about the Way of the Cross, even from my husband. He and his family grew up participating in the Way of the Cross for decades. And he would talk about being there as a young kid when his dad worked for the archdiocese, and being there as a high school student, and how important it was to him and other justice minded folks in Cincinnati.
It was a great leap of faith, I think, on her part and the staff who had not been involved earlier to trust us when we said we thought this was really something that the community needed again.
Some of the reason why it ended initially was because of the amount of time that it took IJPC staff to figure out all of the many logistics that went into planning the event. And so when people approached me, one of the things that I said was that we really needed to figure out a way to make the Way of the Cross a collaborative experience. So we had people from the Cincinnati Archdiocese and some of the local religious communities that had been involved for a long, long time help out. And we also started talking with non-Catholic groups to try to make this version of the Way of the Cross more ecumenical. And so we changed the name from the Way of the Cross, Way of Justice, to the Way of the Cross for Justice. And we stopped referring to the traditional stations as stations and talked more about presentations as a way to try to invite people to think about the shared text and the teachings and stories of Jesus's life. And so the way that we've explained the Way of the Cross for Justice is a collaboration of faith-based groups that engage Good Friday as the prayer experience, and that we are connecting people with social justice issues and the suffering of Jesus through community.
This year, we've had to evolve again, and because of the virus, have had to um, develop a virtual Way of the Cross.
Good and gracious God, as our prayer draws to a close, let us go forth strengthened for mission. May our hearts and minds be open to the suffering of others. May we share our gifts in service of those who are weighted down by oppression.
It's important that there is a voice for the voiceless, that there is information out there that helps raise awareness about the issues that are present in our society today.